All right. So we're in the book of Judges, and we're going to pick up in chapter 17 and finish the book this week. Chapter 7 through the end of chapter 21 is it 21 or 20? I think 21 is the last one, right? Yeah, yep. Okay. Memory. So that is kind of a different section than the rest of the book of Judges, because you're really not looking at a judge coming up and delivering them, and the cycle of the judges isn't really shown here. It's kind of a snapshot of life in Israel. And so as we go through this, and there are kind of three main movements of it, right? You have them defined as the sin for idolatry, the sin for immorality, and civil war that takes place. It's really not looking at those events in the same way as the other parts of Judges, in the sense that it's not following the cycle of falling away, oppression, God, crying out for relief, and God delivering them through a judge and going back into that cycle again. This is just kind of looking at like a bird's eye view, even though we get a lot of detail. It's a bird's eye view of just saying, here's a snapshot of what life was like in Israel in the days of the judges. So it's not about a specific time, although it's talking about events in time. It's ending the book with just saying, you want to know what life was like, here's some examples. And it's not very good, right? You read through these events and Judges and you're going, they just sound really confused. They sound like they have a lack of knowledge of the Scriptures, a lack of knowledge about God. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing, which is the point of Judges, right? Our memory verse is that there was no king in Israel, and so that everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Here's a snapshot of what life was like. And you're going to get three major kind of pictures of, call it cultural reasons why life was so bad, right? Not only is there falling away, but not everybody is even falling away the same way. Everybody's kind of got their own slice of life and going, oh, this is how I think I can do it. This is what my experience is like, and this is what I think I should do. And so you kind of get that it's a very confusing time. And if you're getting that, maybe it helps you to think about today and go, well, let's look at the United States today and kind of look at the mix of hodgepodge of different thoughts and ideas and beliefs and things that people have, and you go, I see some parallels there. And you probably should, because I think you have a lot of confusion in life, and when, as a result of people not knowing or understanding or seeking the Lord, and then the less that they seek Him, the less that they understand, and the more that they just come up with their own ideas. One of the big projects that we had in seminary, in what they would call apologetics and evangelism class, was to go out and talk to people in the world and ask some fairly basic questions. So you would walk up to some either strangers or people. I did a few coworkers. I went to the mall. I talked to people at the mall, and I went out to the park and places where I could meet people. And you'd ask these kind of questions. Well, what are your thoughts or ideas about God? They'd say, I think God is this great guy in the sky who does this or that, or gives people gifts, and he's angry God, and he just, and you go, how do you know that, right? Well, that's just what I think. Well, where'd you get that information from? What do you base it on? It's just things I've heard in my life, right? Well, do you go back to a book or scripture or this book or that? Not really. It's just I kind of take everything I've learned in life and mix it all together. That was the basic outcome of talking to people in the world today, is that some people had an idea. Most people, when they're just out there in the world, there's a large percentage of people who are just taking their experiences in life, mixing them all together and saying, this is my philosophy in life, this is how I determine what God is like, if they even believed in God, right? And so that's kind of the picture that you get to in the book of Judges, is that Judges, when you get into the chapter 17 and you're reading about 17 and you're going, that just sounds weird, right? I mean, like, here's how it goes. And so we'll kind of look at it and pick up this thread in chapter 17. Verse 1 says, there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, hey, I just wanted to let you know in verse 2, the 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and you spoke of it in my hearing. You know what? I took it, right? The silver was with me, and it was I who took it. And instead of getting upset or anything else, she just says, oh, blessed be my son by Yahweh. Hey, at least it didn't leave the family, I guess. I don't know. I mean, if your children come up and confess to stealing a large sum of money from you, you'd think there'd be a little more counseling about repentance or, making it right. But here, she's just like, oh, whatever. Kind of her attitude, right? Which, I found strange. She's like, at least happy. And here's the confusion, right? She says, blessed be my son by Yahweh. They have some concept of God, who is Yahweh, in and around their lives, right? So, but the concept is not complete, and their information is lacking from any scriptural authority, as you'll see. And so it goes on, and it says that he returned in verse 3 the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, I wholly set apart the silver from my hand as holy to Yahweh for my son to make a graven image and a molten image. So now I will return them to you. So verse 3, you're going, okay, what in the world just happened? Right? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. She's saying, oh, this is a good thing by Yahweh that my silver returned. I have a great idea. Let's violate one of the first commandments and just make a graven image of it and worship that. How did they get there? How did they do that? Where did they come up with this from? They're not following the scriptures. They're not looking to, they have this idea about Yahweh, great Yahweh in the sky somewhere, but they don't have it attached to scripture. They don't go back to the books of Moses and say, well, one of the first things you do when you teach your children is that, Lord your God is one God, and then there are 10 commandments that you learn, and then, well, we just blew all that out of the water right there, right? He never learned that from his mom, or your mom never learned that from her parents, because now they're out thinking it's a great idea to build this idol to worship when God says you should have no idols. So that's kind of the framework for chapter 17, right? You're going, okay, they're already off the rails in verse 3, and verse 2 is weird, and, so this is kind of an understanding that they just doing their own thing, right? So it says in verse 4, he returned the silver to his mother. His mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave them to the silversmith, and he made them into a graven image and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine in verse 5, and he made an ephod and the household idols. And he ordained one of his sons, and he became the priest. So Grandma had this silver. The son steals it. They decide it's a great idea to make an idol of it and make the grandkid their priest. We're just going to, this is how church is going to be for us. This is how we're going to do church. So, chapter 17 is just bad right from the start, right? You're going, you guys don't, now that we've all read through the Pentateuch, right? We've all read through Deuteronomy and Joshua. We're going, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you come up with this, right? Obviously, it's just because they're so disconnected from the scriptures, from the covenant, from following a daily life. Like, even if you were living in this time and you just said, well, I don't know, I don't have a clue what to do. At least I can start with the 10 commandments and try to figure that out and start from there. Well, they're not even going to that because they're missing the first few commandments about loving God and not having any idols, right? And no gods before them. That's all gone. They don't have a concept that, well, we know where the priests are. They have their own cities. We know the Levites live in the cities where the priests are supposed to be. That's who's supposed to be a priest. Nope, we're going to make our grandkid the priest. This is how we're going to do it. And so you get the confusion right off the bat. So, any questions up to that point?
I guess I'm just wondering if they had even read, because they had the books of Moses at this point.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So, if they had read that,
didn't
they know, what to do?
Right. This is after the time of Joshua, kind of at the end of the time in Joshua. As we'll see, there's a question about that timing of it, but it's It's a time in which they've settled in the land. It's a time in which they've had the book of the law, like Joshua said, should not depart from your mouth, right? As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And then you end up with this group of people who just come up with their own idea, right? And so verse 6, which I think was our memory verse, if I recall, it repeats it a few times, and it says, because this is why it happened. In those days, there was no king in Israel. There was no leadership. God was their leader, but they weren't following him. They weren't listening to what he said. And so it just comes up with, this is why it happened. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so that's the summary. That's how you get where we're at in the book of Judges. This is the problem. They're not seeking to follow. Again, I mean, even if you know nothing, right? And you have somebody who just says, I just need to know and follow the Lord. I can start somewhere pretty simple and get you on track. We don't have to go very far, right? Again, we can start with the 10 Commandments and get in the right direction. They're just not even going there, right? Let alone all the rest. And so that's just a picture of the culture. And what you get is that this is an example. This means that lots of other people are probably doing their own thing too, right? Somebody else has got an idea that this is how it should be, and maybe we need female priests, and maybe we need this, or maybe we need that, or this is just an example of how they were not following the Lord, right? So these kind of things, as you're going to find out, having a priest and grabbing them and kidnapping them, and not a bad idea in their eyes, because it's going to happen, right? They're going to figure out that this guy's like a lucky charm, and we're going to take him with us wherever we go. And so that's just kind of how it goes. Now it picks up in verse 7, and it says, and there was a young man, new character, young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he was sojourning there. And the man went from the city from Bethlehem in Judah to sojourn wherever he might find a place. Now, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with this guy right off the bat?
He's not in his place.
If he's a Levite, he's got the town and the place where he should be living. It was already apportioned to him, right? So when you settle in the land, for a Levite, they have their 40 cities, I think, that around Israel that they can settle in and have, provision for their priestly duties would be provided for. Here he just says, yeah, I'm a wandering kind of guy. I just got to travel around and go wherever the wind takes me, and that's what he's doing. I'm a traveling priest. So that's what he does. So he's not thinking about things the way God has established them or the way God has revealed to them. He's got his own thing going on too. And so he's just staying there, and then it says in verse 8, right? The man went from city to city in Bethlehem and Judah to sojourn wherever he might find a place, and he made his journey. He came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. Micah said to him, where do you come from? And he said to him, well, I just happen to be a Levite from Bethlehem and Judah, and I am going to sojourn wherever I may find a place. Micah said to him in verse 10, remain with me, and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a suit of clothes, and your sustenance. So the Levite went in. I'm a priest for hire. I'll take money for my job, and I'll come in and be whatever kind of priest you need with these idols that you happen to have in your house, and we'll just figure out some rules as we go along. We'll make up our own thing. Right? And so that's what he did, right? Levite was willing to remain with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons, and he ordained the Levite. Oh, there was an official process. Let's make it official. Smack him in the forehead, you're a priest. You're ordained. Here we go. Pour some oil on him, and off you go. Right? So they have whatever ordination takes place there, and the man became his priest and lived. Now, in verse 13, now I know that Yahweh will prosper me because I bought my own priest. Sounds great. Sounds like how half the world works today. I found something that works for me. God's probably going to bless it, right? It worked once. I'm sure it'll work again. Whatever he thought of as blessing or fortune, he thought, well, things are going my way. Look at this. I got a priest. And so in this town and in this family, this guy takes on the role of a priest and, probably with some influence because of the money that they have. So that's how chapter 17 goes along, right? Verse 13 really tells you what they're thinking, because how do you get to every man did what was right in his own eyes? Well, I know that things are going to go good because we hired a priest. We don't follow the prescription of the priests in the towns they're supposed to be in. We got one for ourselves, and we don't even have to go nowhere. He just lived with us. This is a great idea. So that's the sin for idolatry, right? This is a snapshot of the picture of them making up their own rules for their quote-unquote religion, right? How do they worship? We just make things up as we go along, and as long as things are going good and I've got good luck flowing my way, it must mean that God is on my side.
So, did they have a formal training program for Levites?
Yes.
In school in the law, he should have known, right?
Yeah, so they would have, if things were working properly, right? You would have had priests who were training younger priests who would have been instructed in the law. They would have been teachers of the law. These people would instruct the people in the law, and everything is based on understanding and knowing the books of Moses, right? The whole covenant relationship and priestly duties were all prescribed and taught, should have been taught. Either he was taught and he decided, that's not for me, which is why he went on his merry way and decided to go from town to town, or they were never taught, so he doesn't even know that much. I don't know. But both are options.
In any event, he had a flawed understanding.
Deeply flawed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and nothing to ground him in what he should do, whether by choice or by absence of information or both, right? He's still choosing what to do in his own eyes. They have to have some concept, but, and I'll just, my family, I had a lot of both sides of the family. Beth and myself grew up Catholic, and after we came to know the Lord, we would interact with them on simple levels like, do you guys even know the Ten Commandments? And they would say something like, yeah, I learned that in catechism when I was 10, and, I know a few of them still. I might be able to, but when's the last time you thought about them or read them? Well, I just go to church, I just do my thing, go home, everything seems great, right? I mean, the amount of information is low, generally on the Catholic side of things, right? They don't interact with the scriptures, they're not taught in the same way, and so if there's any teaching, it's on the low side, right? And so by the time they're into adults, when I talk to most of my family members, they're just like, we don't know very much, and we're okay with that. What we know, we're going to use, and this is what we do, and again, they don't know if it really lines up. I've had them say, well, the priest said I was all right, so I'm going to just count on that, right? And so this is the kind of thing, they just come up with an idea of what to do. This is, even wacky. This is a picture of a snapshot of an example of how people are living in Israel. So they just make things up like this. So when you get into chapter 18, it kind of progresses. Now you get into the picture of the Danites. The Danites as a tribe were kind of a problem tribe. And you go back to Joshua, they had a land that was picked for them and allotted for them, but they never really followed God's prescription for settling in the land and clearing it out. They had trouble with doing it because they thought they could do it on their own, and they didn't trust God. So when they had trouble clearing the people out of their land, they went north, and they said, well, it's a lot easier to clear out up here. I know it wasn't given to me, but we'll move north and we'll take that land and do it our own way. And so that took place at the end of Judges, like in chapter 29 or somewhere in there. It's in there, and you can look back, but that's kind of connected to what's going on today. Now they're living in a part of the land that wasn't really for them. They kind of settled on their own choice. It wasn't the way God wanted it or told them to do it. And they're kind of grumpy about it. So they're looking to get a little more. And so they're going, well, I know how to get an inheritance. We'll just start taking more land. And they have this idea to do it is that, well, there's some pretty easy places to go pick off, right? So that's kind of the picture that you get into when you get into chapter 18, is that the Danites, the tribe of Dan, is on the move, doing things their own way, looking to claim the godly inheritance without God involved, thinking it'd be a good idea to do it this way instead of his way. So, when you get there, it says in verse 1, those days there was no king of Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for themselves. We're not happy with how things turned out, so we're seeking an inheritance for ourselves to live in. For until that day, the land among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them as an inheritance. And that's kind of a bad translation. It just says they had the land allotted to them as an inheritance. They just didn't do it the way God wanted. So they didn't want to listen to God, and so they had never settled the way they should have. And so they're looking for their own inheritance for themselves. That's how I would better translate verse 1. It's more about looking for themselves instead of the land allotted and fallen to them had not worked out. And so, as you get in and you kind of see what's taking place, you get this picture, and it says the sons of Dan sent from their family 5 men in verse 2, out of their whole number, men of valor, from certain families. They're going to go and spy out the land. Go find some land for us to take. We don't have enough resources. We need more stuff. Go find people with stuff that we can take. So they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and they lodged there by just happenstance. And there, it says they were near the house of Micah, and they recognized the voice of the young man, the Levite. So they turned aside there and said to him, who brought you here? Wait a minute, you're supposed to be a priest over there. What are you doing over here? How'd you get here? Right? So they recognize somebody who was a priest. They know this guy from whatever point they might have listened to any priests. And he says in verse 4, thus and so has Micah done to me, and he has hired me, and I have become his priest. Things just worked out. I don't know. I was bouncing around looking for something to do. It just kind of worked out. Thus and so. It just kind of worked out. I don't know. Just going with the flow here. Right? And so, that's how I became his priest. And they said to him, ask of God, please, that we may know whether on our way we are going to be successful. So they're saying, well, this is great. Man, we thought we were going to head out here and not have any connection with the priest, and we got this Lucky Charm priest right here in town. We can ask him, boy, give us a good fortune. Tell us things are going to go well. Right? And so the priest said in verse 6, go in peace. Your way in which you are going is before Yahweh. Well, that's generally true. Whatever way you're going is going to be before Yahweh. God's going to be around there somewhere. He may not be pleased, but he's going to be there. Go ahead and go in peace. God's just going to be around. God will be before you. It is an indication that he's telling them God will kind of bless your way. But it's not the normal way that you would talk about Yahweh and God, right? He's just kind of making his own thing up. So the 5 men went forth and came to Laish, and that name in verse 7 is kind of the place where you can connect back into Joshua and see what happened there. And it saw the people who were living in security after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. And there was no oppressive conqueror kind of lording it over them for anything in the land. For they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. So this is like a backwater up north town where nothing's really... They got a lot of stuff, but not a lot of police around, right? So nobody from the Sidonians who established this city, they don't really have the police hanging around. They're too far away, too remote. But they've got it good. And so it says they came back to their brothers and said, hey, get up, let's go. We got this great town to pick off. Right in verse 9. Let's go and get the land. Let's go and get what they have. Nobody's even watching over it, right? And so they make the plan. They get a plan there through verse 13, and they said, we're heading back there to pick this town off. It's going to be easy pickings. And besides, we had this great priest who said things are going to go well. So, we can count on that too. And so as you get through, you see that what happens then is that the 5 men who were sent to spy, they go out, they answered and said, "Do you know that there are in those houses an ephod and idols? Hey, by the way, we passed by. This great priest went and told us things are going to go good." Their idea is that, you know what? Let's go pick them up and take them with us. We just need to. How do you do that? You just go in there with your swords and you tell them, "Look, we're going and you're coming with us." So that's kind of how they do it. They said, they kind of give them a choice. You know what? You should choose to come with us. It'll go a lot better for you. Rattle, rattle, rattle of their swords, if you do. But, choice is yours. So they kind of threatened them in a little bit threatening way, and they said, up, verse 19, "Be silent," right? "Put your hand over your mouth and come with us, to be a father and a priest for us." It's better for you to be a priest to the house of one man or to a priest of a whole tribe. Dude, we're expanding your borders, dude. You're going to be the priest of the Danites now. We're going to take you home with us because we think you're pretty lucky. So this is the way we want it to go. You can shut up. By the way, we're going to take the silver idols and stuff too. Just cover your mouth. Don't look the other way, but here we go. We're taking all the wealth with us too. So we're robbing this guy. But don't worry about that. I'm sure God's with us. We take you with us. Everything's going to be okay. So that's their thought process in chapter 18, right? And so they go along their way and they take this town and they are able to conquer it. And in verse 30, when you get all the way down to verse 30, this is the outcome. It says, "The sons of Dan set up for themselves the graven image, and Jonathan the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, he and his sons were priests of the tribe of Danites until the day of the exile of the land." So what happens here in these random events of this guy making up his own religion, it lasted a long time. Lasted a long time, possibly to the time of the very exile of like the Assyrians coming in, right? So you have 500 years this thing could have gone on, and maybe 600-700 years. It could have been a different oppression, that they're mentioning, but it sounds like with the language, I think the best way to understand that is that probably up to the Assyrian captivity, these Danites are running around with their Danite religion, Danology or whatever you want to call it, and they're doing their thing for a long time. And so a snapshot of Judges is that this thing is going to exist throughout the kingdom age. As you get into Saul and David, and this thing's still going on. This thing doesn't stop. And I think that's a pretty valid picture. So a lot of what happens in the book of Judges, right, and you're going, it just sounds like a confusing time. It really continues all throughout the time of the kings. And it really continues all the way through the captivity. Things like this.
It almost, I hadn't thought of it, but it almost sounds like it's Romans 1, where they're given over to, their lust or their whatever, their sin.
Yeah. So one of the things I've been trying to track, and I'm trying to get into it with our class too, is that in the past, when you read through Samuel and Kings and stuff, you get these ideas that when Elijah and Elisha come on the scene, that they're not very popular in the main populations of town, but they're always kind of hanging out in the wilderness with the sons of the prophets and other groups like that, where you kind of get these, and that's where in the Bible you'll get to the idea of God always kind of deals with a remnant, right? You hear that term in the scriptures, that there is always a remnant. So that when Elijah says, look, there's nobody else around, and he says, no, I have a few thousand people who have not bowed their knee to Baal, right? Well, that's out of millions of people. God literally is saying, I got a few thousand people out of a few million who have not bowed their knee to Baal. What are the rest of them doing? Stuff like in Judges. Okay? I think that it's hard to get caught up. You kind of go, well, now that there's a king in the land, everything got cleaned up. I don't think that's very true. I think things get a little more orderly, and things have, you have waves of revival and times of seeking the Lord that are a little more cohesive than in the Judges. But as you see all the wicked kings that exist, you realize what they're doing is they're just caught up in the Judges. They're just caught up in the chaos of the cultural confusion that never really gets cleaned up. Okay, so when we're looking at these snapshots at the end of Judges, I think it's saying when you go into the kingdom, this is what it's like. This is what it's like when Samuel and Saul and David are coming on the scene. This is what they got to deal with, these kind of things. It doesn't go away. It just kind of gets ickier. And every time you have the kings and the people falling away and a wicked king comes up and falls into idolatry, this is what life was like. This is your snapshot to think back on and go, yep, this is kind of what they're dealing with. So Israel, in terms of following the Lord, in the time of settling in the land, really falls into the pattern of just looking for the remnants, looking for the faithful ones who are following the Lord, realizing most people are caught up in this. So, sorry to paint such a bleak picture, but it's the history of Israel. I think you need to understand how God really looks at the kingdom there. So we'll get more into that. But that's chapter 18. Any questions about chapter 18? And again, you can connect back with the Danites and Joshua and see how they were already snapshot there, not following the Lord, and this is the expanded version of it, I think. It's how I look at it. So this is just how they end up with their own religion in Dan, and why Dan is kind of one of those tribes you're going, whatever happened, this is what happened. They fell into idolatry and never recovered.
Were there other tribes that followed that wrong?
Probably by individuals going, oh, you know what? I was traveling through, it sounded like a great new thing going on over there. I think I'll follow that one. I don't know that whole tribes did it. Could be. But I think that those kind of false religions like this, not even Baal worship, everything you hear about in the kingdom, they're following the Baals. This weird stuff's going on too. They're calling it Yahweh. They're calling it, Jewish. It's more Jewish than Baal, but it's still their own thing, right? So this is a false Jewish religion mixed with whatever they felt like putting in there, and it's just not following the truth. But they would have said they were Jewish. They would have said they were living in the land the way God wanted them. They're just making it up, though.
These last time they mentioned Revelations also, I think.
Yeah.
Dan and the half tribe of Manasseh.
Yeah.
They didn't get what was the half tribe of Manasseh? Were they following that?
So you had a half tribe east and a half tribe west, I think, and a part of that is that they fell into rebellion too, and that was that's a part of I think Gideon. I think is where that ends up, but I have to remember.
They're not necessarily tied, but they both.
No, but they both had different rebellions, different Dan, because they just did their own thing up until the end, and God said they never recovered. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll get into chapter 19 and finish the book. And as you get into chapter 19, you're kind of following this whole pattern of now the immorality that takes place, right? And so now you have this awful scenario. It says it happened in those days in chapter 19, verse 1, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite sojourning in the remote part of the hill country. Now, we just left one Levite who decided to go on his own and start his own religion. Now we got a second Levite. This is an indication of the priesthood, right? It's just, they're not really happy with their lot in life. They go out and make their own way, okay? And a lot of them are traveling around and kind of figuring out their own thing. This guy's figuring it out. And it says he took a concubine for himself for Bethlehem and Judah. Now, the idea of a concubine is kind of a legal status, but it's not a wife, but it's not a wife, and it's kind of out there, and you could tie yourself to this woman and start a family, but it's kind of a half family, and it kind of is a family, and it kind of isn't a family. They get most of the rights, but not all of the rights, and don't ask me because I don't know. Never had a concubine before, so... but this is how life was. In the past, Abraham and others took on these concubines and wives, and when God established the law, he said, it's just one man and one woman. You guys need to drop that stuff. But it's always kind of continuing on here, and so this concubine thing is still out there, and it's not the wisest idea, especially for a Levite who's a priest. They're allowed to be married, by the way. Just this concubine thing is an issue, because it's not the best idea. But in verse 2, his concubine played the harlot against him, and she went away from him to her father's house. And that should have been the end of it. Should have said, well, as a Levite, you're not allowed to marry a prostitute anyway, and a wife of harlotry would not make sense. I'll just leave that one, separate, divorce, and get out of that icky mess. But he doesn't. And so it says that she went into Judah and there for a period of 4 months, but her husband arose and went after her to speak to her heart in order to bring her back. Right? So you have this whole process of going out that then the father comes and says, oh, I'm glad you're coming back for her, because what am I going to do with, she's ruined now. She's a wife of harlot. She's a harlot. I can't marry her off or get anything for her. I'm glad you're coming back for her. Okay? Just not to put too fine a point on it. That's what I look at when I interpret that he's glad to see this guy. Good, because nobody else is going to want her. Right? And that's a common thing in this day. She had ruined herself through harlotry. She's not fit to be somebody else's wife. You're not going to get her married off to anybody else. It'll be very hard or difficult, even in this crazy time. And so he's like, best option, go back to where you came from. Go back with this guy. It's your best option. So he's probably glad to get her back to this guy, this Levite. So the whole process, and I won't get into all the confusion there, right? But you have this whole thing about getting ready to leave, and he doesn't let him leave, and he doesn't getting ready to leave, and I'm not sure what that's all about, to be honest with you, except just it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, except maybe he just wanted to gain more ties with this guy, maybe because he's a Levite, and maybe he would be a good luck charm, maybe they'd stay around and bless us while you're around here, because obviously my children aren't doing very great. At least we got a guy who has a decent sense of something. And so you get a picture of this flavor again, of this is how they look at a Levite, this is how they look at what's going on. You know, the Levite doesn't have any problem with their harlotry. Not that you can't repent and get right about things, but that doesn't seem to be, maybe that's the case, but still they're in this pattern of just going, well, instead of dealing with it, I'll just try to speak kindly and maybe we can just patch things up and sweep it under the rug is more what I get out of it than making anything right. And so when you get to chapter 13 or chapter 19 and verse 13, they're looking for a place to stay. They look and they turn aside and they enter a city and no one will take him in, right? So by the time you get to verse 20, you get one guy who says, what are you hanging out in the open square for? Well, I've been hanging out here and nobody will take me in. Well, let me offer you some hospitality and take you in. Do not spend the night in the square, right? That sounds at least like a decent option, and it probably is. It's better than... The picture is that most people in town are not going to talk to a guy like him. They don't want anything to do with a stranger. They're not going to offer hospitality. They're not going to be gracious and kind. They're not looking to help people traveling along their way. Maybe it's kind of like a high crime area. Maybe they're going, yep, you lock your doors at night, you don't talk to strangers like him. That's how you get robbed. That's how you get in trouble, right? And this guy says, well, I can't leave you out here. We got to get you in before something happens. Well, something still happens. So they get into this whole place where they're in the house, and in verse 22, it says they were making in their hearts merry, and behold, the men of the city, certain vile fellows, surrounded the house, pounding on the door. And they spoke to the owner of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. So they're ready to have relations with him. They're ready to engage in homosexuality. So in this time of the period of Israel and the history of Israel, make no mistake, homosexuality was alive and kicking, and it was a normal thing here that, even at the end, nobody's bothered by that, as I'll explain. They're irritated that you want to take a guy out by force, but not about what they want to do. Like, you want to go do that, go do it, but don't take the guy out of my house, right? So homosexuality is a cultural norm at this time, even though God has commanded against it. Now, when you get into verse 23, he says, please don't act so wickedly, and don't, this man has come into my house. Don't, hospitality is important. I'm responsible for this guy. I can't let you have him, right? So verse 23 sounds like he's trying to do the right thing, but until you get to verse 24. Rather than give up the stranger, let me give up my daughter and the concubine. Do whatever you want with them. Sleep with them, have a party with them. Just don't bother the guy in my house. I am responsible for him. So in the culture at this time, they've got a bad understanding about women's rights. Let me tell you, this is not biblical. And they're thinking, this is the better way out. We can let you party with the women. Just don't take the guy in my house.
Mirrors Sound of the Morse right there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, the same kind of thing. Yeah, we're banging on the door. Bring them out so we can have homosexual relations, right? God burned the whole city down for that, but we're back to it again, right? And so it's not unusual in the sense that, nobody seems bothered by the fact that they want to have, this kind of activity, because go out and have sinful activity with the women, just not the guy, right? Because he's under my protection. The women apparently don't count and are not under his protection, when both of the men should have been like, we're going to protect this no matter what. That would have been a biblical response. We're not letting anything happen. We're going to trust God and protect you up to the end. They do not. So go ahead and ravish them and do whatever you wish. And they do, right? And so they do the very thing. The men were not willing to listen, but the man took hold of his concubine and just threw her out the door. Right? Push her out the door and lock the door. So that's what happens in verse 25. They knew her and abused her all night until morning, and they let her go at the break of dawn. But as day began to dawn, in verse 26, the woman came and fell down at the door, pretty much died at the door of the house. Now, this guy has no idea what happened to her until the next day, right? He's not worried in the sense of, looking out, finding out what happened until the morning, right? And so he says in verse 28, get up, let us go, right? Let's go. But there was no answer. So she had been raped all night and died at the door, and he doesn't even get it when it says there was no answer. He's hoping that maybe she survived. Maybe she happened to survive this thing and she's just unconscious. Well, whether she was dead there or along the way, right? The man arose and went to his home. And that's the picture. It says in verse 30, right? He cut her, or verse 29, he went home and cut her into 12 pieces and sent them out to the 12 tribes as a warning. Right? This is how bad our culture has gotten. These things are happening and nobody cares. And so I'm sending out a message to say we can't continue this downward spiral of morality where these things can happen and nobody does anything about it. And so that's what it says in verse 30 when it says, we all who saw it say, nothing like this has ever happened or has been seen from the day when we came up out of Egypt. We need to figure out how to stop this thing, right? This downward spiral. And so that's the picture that you get up through chapter 19 is this is a picture of the culture. They don't know how to stop homosexuality. They don't know how to stop brutal rapes and murders. Their criminal elements are bad enough that nobody helps strangers, and the culture is just base-ridden. It makes you kind of feel how the big cities are today, right? You think about the big cities and their struggles with immigration coming in, crime just increasing. California can't even keep people from defecating on people's living in front of their houses, right? And disgusting things like that are happening in our day and age. And we know that these kind of things, this kind of crime happens on a daily basis. So this is the picture of Israel. These are the kind of crimes that are being committed. This is how far off they are until they're shocked into going, we got to do something about this. Life is just not good. So that's where you get into chapter 19, is the picture of they just come to the realization, how did we ever let it get this bad? They don't know. They don't know what the solution is. They don't know what the answer is. They don't know that they should repent and turn to God. They're just going, the police aren't doing their job. and we don't know how to make it work. Right? Maybe they're defunding the police back in Israel too, and they don't have any. I don't know, but this is what they're doing, and they're going, crime is bad, and nothing is working. So that's the way I would kind of snapshot chapter 19. Chapter 20, you get into this whole civil war where everybody's going to rise up, they're going to go back, and they're going to go after the Benjamites. They're going to say, well, this thing happened in the tribe of Benjamin, we're going to go and make it right. We're going to go settle this one because we got to get tough on crime. Right? So we're going to make sure that this crime is avenged. We're going to make sure that these things can't happen in Israel. So they said, well, Benjamin, we're coming in, and you need to give them up, and we need to get proper vengeance, proper justice for this crime. So give them up. Benjamin says, no. Leave us alone. Right? It's a Benjamite problem. We'll handle it whatever way we feel like. Get out of our business. Right? Sometimes you hear that. I remember people saying that about mayoral races in the city of Detroit. Right? It was a black and white thing, and they would say, "This is our city. Get out. You don't have anything to say about it." Right? And they meant racially. That they didn't want people from the suburbs having any influence in the city of Detroit or any decision making. It took a long time, right? They had conversations like that. Benjamites are saying, get out of our business. So they go to war. And we're going to have to just kind of snapshot it here. But they go to war. They have the whole thing that takes place. They kill everybody in the town. They go to war. It's a confusing war in which they lose a few rounds, and God is saying, you're really not looking for God's solution out of this whole thing. And so both sides are kind of getting chewed up here and losing victims, and until the end when they kind of plead and fast and God allows them to finish it up. And in the end, they would have decimated the tribe of Benjamin. There would have been nobody left to continue an inheritance for Benjamin unless they came up with these weird solutions. And one of them, they said, well, there was one town that didn't come and help us, and because of that, they didn't make the vow about not marrying into Benjamin that they made. There was a vow that was made that said, because Benjamin is not helping us, we're never going to let our children marry anybody from Benjamin. And they didn't know how to go back on that, and so they come up with a couple of loopholes just to shorten it up here. The first one was they said, here's a town that didn't participate in the justice, and because of that, they didn't take the vow. Therefore, we can just give up, and I think it was 400 was the number, women, and they can come out and they can be married into the tribe of Benjamin. So they force it on them. They just, this is what you're doing because we made a mistake and we almost killed everybody in Benjamin. And they realized that wasn't a great idea. The second solution was they're going to come up with a, weird Hunger Games kind of solution, and they said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a city festival, and if you happen to come and kidnap any of the women out of there we'll just look the other way and not say anything about it, and that way you can find a wife, and we'll try to solve it that way. That way we didn't break our vow because we didn't let you do it, but we were looking the other way, and you just happened to kidnap them, and what are we going to do? Not very elegant or godly solutions in any of the case. And so we're running out of time, so if you have any questions, bring them up next week. Write them down, and we can deal with them before we get into Ruth. I just had to wrap up these last chapters here, and that's just kind of how the flow of Judges goes. And again, the snapshot from chapter 18 through 21 is just life in Israel, the time of the Judges, that I would submit to you continues on into the kingdom and is always there, which is why the kingdom never goes really great. It's a part of life in Israel now. It's been established, and they never really get out of it. They have times of revival and times of growth under good kings, but then when a king who doesn't follow the life of David and doesn't follow in David's footsteps, these are the things that come in and chew up the culture and come right back into play immediately upon a bad king, along with Baal and along with all false gods. All right, let me pray and we'll get ready for our service. Father, we just pray, Lord, that even with the shock of seeing life in the Scriptures, maybe we didn't know that it was like that, and we see too many parallels to our own time and the culture that we live in. Help us to be faithful to you, Lord, and to be that faithful remnant, and to proclaim the truth to people in need, that we may call them out of a life of deadness and sins into a life with you. Help us to be faithful in that and to be a witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I pray in his name. Amen.